Well, thanks very much to Dominique for the introduction, and also to Dominique and Jonathan for bringing me here. As Dominique said, there are close relations between the kinds of work that we're doing in my department in London and what's being done here in your department in Vanderbilt. So I hope that this will be the beginning of a very constructive working relationship. And I'd also like to thank you all. I'm very surprised to see so many of you here making it out through the snow and wind. So thank you very much, and I hope we can entertain you for the next hour and a half or so. So I'm going to talk on this topic of our brains ourselves, and as you'll see up on the screen behind me, there are some slides. I'm going to whip through the slides very quickly, and you won't really miss anything if you don't see them. They're kind of illustrative, but maybe at the end, if I can use an old-fashioned psychological word, you'll have a bit of a gestalt from all the slides, and that's what I aim to provide you with. So let's get going. It's difficult to know what we should make of all this talk about the brain these days. It almost appears as if every aspect of human conduct, in particular those things that used to be explained in psychological terms, should now be understood in terms of neuroscience. And responses, especially from the social and human sciences, have varied from, on the one hand, enthusiastic jumping on the neuro bandwagon, to, on the other hand, critiques of neuromania. In my recent book, Neuro, which I wrote with Joël Abi-Rached, we argued for a different relationship between the social and human sciences and the neurosciences that we termed critical friendship. And the talk I'm going to give you today is offered in that spirit. Some of you, I guess, will hear this talk as against neuroscience, but it's not. It's actually a talk for neuroscience, or rather a talk that is a call for neuroscience to become a genuinely human science. Oh, by the way, we have no mic here, so if my voice drops, can you please wave and I'll try and project. So I'd like to begin with a remark from Michel Foucault's essay, What is Enlightenment? Foucault says we should practice criticism as a historical investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we're doing, thinking, and saying. And it's in that ethos that I undertook my work on neuroscience to ask whether some events have led us to begin to constitute ourselves in new ways as subjects of what we're doing, thinking, and saying. That's to say, it's an exercise in what some of us have come to call historical ontology. Now, that book, Neuro, traced the history of neuroscience from the invention of the term really rather recently in 1962 to the present, the term invented by Francis O. Schmidt, a biophysicist working at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Schmidt argued, as you'll see on this slide, that we needed to understand the brain in the same way that molecular biology had begun to understand the body. There's an urgency, he said, in effectuating a quantum step in our understanding of the mind, not only as an academic exercise of scientific research, not only to alleviate mental distress, but not only to create an entirely new type of science, and hence to survive this present world crisis in human evolution, but perhaps through an understanding of the mind to learn more about the nature of our own being. 50 years later, another eminent neuroscientist, Vernon Mountcastle, said this, 1998, "The half-century's accumulation of knowledge of brain function has brought us face to face with the question of what it means to be human. We make no pretension that solutions are at hand, but assert that what makes man human is his brain. Things, mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains." So in 50 years, we've moved from the hope that one might understand the brain in terms of molecular biology to a statement of belief that's probably now held by almost anyone working in this area. There is a physical basis of mind in the brain. Mental processes arise from physical processes in the brain, or to put it crudely, mind is what brain does. Now today, rather than rehearsing the arguments of my recent book directly, what I want to do is to proceed by identifying some developments. Perhaps we could call them nodes. I just thought of that in the plane on the way over, so perhaps we shouldn't. And that can exemplify the range of mutations we need to engage with if we're going to understand this new ontology. There are the 6 nodes up on the slide there, and the first node is brain disorders. First, let's consider the rise of the phrase, the burden of brain disorders. We've had surveys of psychiatric epidemiology for many years, and we could trace these back to the early US censuses and debates in the late 19th century about whether the number of freed slaves who were in lunatic asylums indicated that freedom was not the natural or healthy condition for the Negro. There's a whole eugenic discourse on the burden of degenerates on the race, reaching its apotheosis in the Nazi calculation of costs in Reichsmarks to each healthy German worker of maintaining a feeble-minded or insane degenerate. But psychiatric epidemiology, as we know it today, begins after the Second World War, partly in response to a perception of the scale of mental disorder in the non-institutionalized population that had been brought about by the number of people in the military services. Now, there were a range of studies in the 1960s and 1970s of the prevalence of mental disorder, much criticized because of their methodology and the vagueness of what they were actually measuring. But by the early 1980s, it was widely believed that some 15% of the adult non-institutionalized population suffered from mental disorder. And some were contending that the US was facing a pandemic of mental disorder. From the 1990s, surveys in the US by Kessler and his colleagues, and in Europe by Witchen and his colleagues, were regularly estimating that 25% of the adult population, 25% of the adult population not receiving psychiatric care, were diagnosable with DSM diagnosable categories of psychiatric disorder. And that number went up to over a third when children and the elderly were included. From about the 1980s, we can also see a transformation in the way in which this prevalence of mental disorder was conceptualized. Attempts to quantify the experience of living with mental disorders, to estimate the costs to individuals, to families and society of those disorders, and in particular the burden of depression. And indeed, by the 1980s, this was being explicitly articulated in that language of burden, not here as a genetic load on the population, as it had been in the eugenic days, but as costs borne by healthcare systems, plus the indirect costs of time lost from productive work and so on. And about the same time, the Global Burden of Disease study, initiated by the World Bank in 1990, shifted its focus from the number of people dying from a disease, from mortality, to the number of people living with disease, using their new measure of the DALYs, disability-adjusted life years lost, and in so doing, it started to highlight the burden of non-communicable diseases, notably neuropsychiatric diseases. And as you'll see in this slide, by 2011, Uli Witchen and his colleagues were referring to all these disorders, all these burdensome disorders, as brain disorders, psychiatric and neurological, and calculating the burden of brain diseases running from anxiety to Alzheimer's, from insomnia to epilepsy, all disorders of the brain. Partly framed in terms of estimates from the WHO of the growing burden of such disorders across the world, a growing movement took shape to address the so-called grand challenge in mental health, focusing specifically on what were now called the MNS disorders, mental, neurological and substance use disorders, which were said to constitute about 13% of the total global burden of disease. So what should we make of this argument? Not only that all these conditions are, quote, brain disorders, but also they're to be understood as, quote, a burden. Brain disorders from anxiety to Alzheimer's, brain disorders from insomnia to epilepsy, including, of course, the addictions. I'm going to leave that question hanging for a while. But what about the idea that they're to be understood as a burden? I find that term burden particularly distasteful. But this argument about the burden of brain disorders on individuals, families, communities, and nation plays a key role in the rhetoric of funding for the big brain projects, and these are the second node which I want to discuss. So node 2 is the big brain projects. Big science has certainly come to the brain. As Dominique remarked, I am myself involved in the social and ethical division of the Human Brain Project, funded by the European Community to the tune of 1.2 billion euros. 1.2 billion euros, that's about $1.2 billion over 10 years. The Human Brain Project aims to build a simulation of the human brain, neuron by neuron, in a neuromorphic supercomputer to integrate as much as possible of contemporary neuroscientific knowledge of the brain, which, by the way, now runs at something like 100,000 peer-reviewed publications a year. To try and integrate that 100,000 peer-reviewed publications a year in this model of the brain and to use that for simulation. The claim is that this can power great understandings, not only of the normal human brain, but also of all these brain diseases that burden our nation, as well as engendering great advances in neurorobotics. One key aim of the medical dimension of the HBP is to identify the so-called neural signatures of these brain diseases to facilitate the personalization of diagnosis and treatment. And I'll return later to this idea that the brain should be the locus for the diagnosis of mental ailments. But it's not only the Human Brain Project. There are brain projects in Japan, in China, in Latin America, and most notably the US Brain Project, which focuses on circuits. Some call this the moonshot for our generation. As Francis Collins puts it, quote, "Our goal, to produce the first dynamic view of the human brain in action, revealing how its roughly 86 billion neurons and its trillions of connections interact in real time. This new view will revolutionize our understanding of how we think, feel, learn, remember, and move, transforming efforts to help the more than 1 billion people worldwide who suffer from autism, depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other devastating brain disorders." Close quotes. So you see how this argument about the burden of brain disorders gradually begins to build up in a range of different areas. Actually, the US project is also intriguing because it's funded to about 40% by DARPA, the Defense and Allied Research Projects Agency, whose interests include brain stimulation to boost the identification of satellite images, neuroprosthetics, that is to say cortical implants that enable an individual to control a prosthetic limb, a robot, or a drone by the power of thought alone. They also include thought identification that would enable a readout of specific thoughts from the human brain in action, and the linkage of numerous brains in so-called neural nets, and no doubt much more. Perhaps, indeed, they might include modern versions of the famous stimosievers developed by José Delgado in the 1960s that could indeed both read out and read into the brain, leading to his 1969 book, Physical Control of the Mind, which perhaps was rather unwisely subtitled Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. In the US, the involvement of DARPA seems to cause little concern, while the Human Brain Project has an explicit commitment not to accept military funding or to involve itself in the military uses of its results. But actually, that's a rather forlorn promise if the technologies that it develops are in their very nature, quote, dual use. So one issue we might want to think about is how we might deal with the ineradicable presence of dual use in this recent work on the brain. Now, there are two other points worth drawing out from the US Brain Project. The first is the recognition that the neuroreductionist approach of much neuroscience since the 1960s has reached its limits. Neuroreductionism was an incredibly powerful experimental strategy. And indeed, neuroreductionism was at the heart of the project launched by Schmidt in 1962. And it was based on the belief that the first step for neuroscientific advance was the most precise characterization of the elements of the basic unit of the brain, the neuron. Its membrane structures, its ion channels, its receptor sites, its firing and signaling mechanisms, its mode of transmission across synapses, and so on. This synaptic and molecular vision of the brain generated huge advances. But it's worth pointing out that these studies were always intended to be the first step towards a, quote, scaling up from neurons to brain circuits, to regions and so forth, and ultimately to functions and behavior. But scaling up has proved incredibly difficult, even with simple creatures, let alone mammals, primates, and humans. Excuse me. Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on memory, believed very firmly in this neuroreductionist approach. He had started, actually, when he came to the US as a psychoanalyst, but he turned to study the simplest creature he could find that had memory, the Californian sea slug. It's actually got some more elegant names, but I like that one the best. The Californian sea slug has a nervous system of around 1,000 neurons, each of which one can see through a microscope. It also has a primitive memory. It has a gill which withdraws when it's touched. If you touch it again, it withdraws the gill again. But if you touch it again, after a while, it stops withdrawing it. It has a gill withdrawal reflex, yet after a while, it stops withdrawing its gill. So it must have, quotes, remembered. Now, Kandel spent about 50 years trying to figure out how this happened. How did the Californian sea slug remember? If you read his autobiography, he begins by discussing what happened when he was a young boy in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. The stormtroopers broke into his house while he was playing on the floor with a little blue train. More than half a century later, he knows an awful lot about the sea slug and how it remembers. But he still does not know much, if anything at all, as to how and why he still has the most vivid memory of sitting on that floor playing with that little blue train. He could not scale up. Nonetheless, this was how he thought neuroscience should be done, one cell at a time, learn the mechanism, then scale it up to more complex creatures and more complex memories. Here you see the virtues and the problems of the neuroreductionist approach. We've yet to scale up to the mechanisms of memory. Now, the US Brain Project is not short on hype, but it's also very frank about the difficulties, about how much we do not know in trying to move from DNA sequences to proteins, to cells, to synapses, to circuits, to functions, to behavior, cognition, and consciousness. Its hopes that we can achieve this are based in part on the view that new visualizing technologies, such as optogenetics, which can light up individual cells using very fancy targeted mechanisms, can at least enable us to envision the brain at the level of functional circuits, something like you see on these slides here. Vision here has a rather important epistemological role, and one might wonder why and how that is. To see activity, to see the circuits, to see is to know, is to see to know. Actually, this emphasis on the visual was one of the things that irritated researchers who started mapping brain functions using functional magnetic resonance imaging and positron emission tomography. The researchers argued that what they were doing was best expressed in equations and only loosely captured by these entrancing images. Nevertheless, in the emphasis on widely distributed neural circuits in US brain, there's a critique of that, quotes, blobology that's entranced many researchers and the popular press for about 20 years. This powerful visual imaginary, generated by the, quotes, lighting up of discrete brain areas when changes in oxygenated blood flow are imaged, has led to thousands of papers claiming to discover the neural location of language, emotion, decision-making, fear, anxiety, perceptions of beauty, maternal love, autism, dyslexia, and much more. I think a little phrase from the historian of statistics, Gerd Gigerenzer, is useful here. Tools to theories. This really is a matter of tools to theories. For while there's a long historical tradition of research on localization, there's no reason at all to believe that functions or malfunctions are localized in this way, or they're mapped by arbitrary changes in brain chemistry. Oh, this is just Russell Poldrack saying exactly the same thing. He's very good. I'd read him, but not now. Further, each voxel that is visualized contains up to 100,000 neurons and 5 million synapses, which is poor resolution indeed, and technologies such as fMRI can only see changes at a speed much less than the speed of neural activity. But more fundamentally, we simply don't know at what scale in the brain we should be mapping the neurofunctional bases of complex activities. As someone once remarked, you wouldn't read a newspaper with a microscope. Now, the US brain, as I've already said, places its emphasis on circuits at a kind of meso level, above the individual cell, but below the level of the whole brain. But is that the level at which human ontology is to be situated? I'm going to leave that question hanging, but I'm going to return to it later. And let me just turn now to my third node, which is drugs. This might all hang together when we get to the end, so don't worry. I hope it does, but you never know. The arguments that underpin the brain projects can tell us something about a rather paradoxical feature of our global present, which has to do with psychiatric drugs. More and more of our fellow citizens are routinely taking these drugs, notably the antidepressants, in the hope that they will modulate their emotions, reduce sadness and anxiety, enable better social functioning in personal life, family relations, work, leisure, and much more. The neuroleptics, such as chlorpromazine, largactil, thorazine, were invented in the 1950s, initially used for control within the asylum, gradually becoming the rationale for the treatment of patients outside hospitals. Also in the 1950s, we saw the invention of the first tranquilizers, Miltown, Librium, and Valium, which became famous as mother's little helpers, but rapidly became part of every doctor's drug box. They were joined later by the antidepressants, imipramine in the late 1950s, amitriptyline in the 1960s, and the availability of the drugs went hand in hand with a great increase in the diagnosis of depression amongst people outside the hospital. And finally, they were joined by the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs such as Prozac and its sisters, which came onto the market in the 1980s to such cultural excitement and rapidly broadened their scope from depression to panic, anxiety, and much more. Initially, these drugs were based on an idea of coping. The drugs helped one cope with the pressures and demands of everyday life. But gradually, as you'll see in these pictures up here, the promise changed to a more positive one. Become yourself again. Take these drugs and you'll become yourself again. You can get your life back. You can live your life as an autonomous human being in your everyday world without being dragged down by worries, anxiety, and depression. By 2010, as I said, the taking of these drugs had become a worldwide phenomenon. But the paradox is that this is occurring at the very time when the scientific rationale for the mode of action of these drugs is losing credibility. Now, once we would have put down the spread of these drugs to the ambition of the drug companies, and many did blame big pharma, direct-to-consumer advertising, the suborning of psychiatrists, the publication of misleading results from clinical trials, the willful misinterpretation of evidence, the laxity of the regulators, and so on and so forth. And no doubt all of these have played their part, together with the hope of consumers for pills to ameliorate their ills and disappointments, the wishes of doctors to be able to do something for their patient, the attraction of identifying a physical cause for your distress or despair, and so much more. But most of these drugs are now out of patent, and many are now made in generic form by pharmaceutical companies in developing countries like Ranbaxy in India. And the major pharmaceutical companies are now moving out of development of drugs for the central nervous system. Why is that? Because despite 40 years of research, many new hopes and many bold claims, it's simply not proved possible for the pharmaceutical companies to develop new drugs that are more effective or more specific than those produced by serendipity in the 1960s, the advertisements I showed you a moment ago. And despite the huge market for drugs to treat the dementias, all the dementia drugs have failed in clinical trials. And for the pharmaceutical companies, or at least for their shareholders, there are better ways to make money. And the pharma companies are turning away. Now, we should reflect on the reasons for the epidemic of drug use. And I think those reasons are complex, and as we've seen in our discussions over the last day or so, they're highly varied from one locale to another. But we should also reflect on the failure to create more effective pharmacological interventions. Almost all the drugs developed from the 1960s worked on the basis that there was an underlying molecular mechanism for mental disorders, an anomaly in the neurotransmitter system. This quote that I put on the slide here from Joseph Schildkraut's paper in 1965 was absolutely a classic to begin to describe what they thought was going on here, the so-called catecholamine hypothesis of affective disorders. Either too much or too little of one transmitter or another transmitter was responsible for each mental disorder. Serotonin for depression, too little, dopamine for schizophrenia, too much, and so on and so forth. And what was happening here was there was something wrong with either the mechanism for the production or the elimination of the monoamine, the neurotransmitter, something wrong with the mechanism for reuptake or for reception. Mental disorders were neurochemical disorders. Drugs try and target and correct the problems of neurochemistry. And here you see it in these cartoons from the Eli Lilly website from about 15 years ago. Now, most people would now agree that if these drugs work at all, and that is a moot point, especially for mild to moderate disorders, it is not because they raise or lower levels of neurochemicals available in the synapses. This neurotransmitter theory of disorders, and reciprocally the molecular theory of the mechanisms underpinning normal brain functions, has proved to be fundamentally misleading. Now, of course, this isn't everybody's view, and some researchers are exploring the role of some other of the 100 or so chemicals that can act as neurotransmitters, glutamate, for example. But this vision of the synaptic self is fading before our eyes. and many are turning to more direct interventions, direct to the brain, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation. Again, major claims are made for their efficacy, but we have even less understanding of their efficacy. So here's the paradox. The drugs don't do nothing, they don't work as they claim to work, but nonetheless, people are taking them more and more enthusiastically. On the top picture here, you can see the number of people in the US who are taking medication for their mental health. And in the lower slide, you can see country by country the numbers of those in the OECD region who are taking the antidepressants. Now, the drugs, to use a phrase from my friend David Healy, whose work I don't always agree with these days, but to use a phrase from David Healy, the drugs don't do nothing. And we know that drugs that mess with our neurotransmitters, usually en masse and rather unselectively, like alcohol, LSD, psilocybin, certainly do transform experiences, sometimes in ways that seem to mimic psychiatric distress. And this, of course, was one of the observations that led to all this neurotransmitter research in the first place. And rather oddly, there's now a new pathway of research underway, at least in the UK, which is exploring the therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs. But we can learn from this as well. We can term this the principle of non-reversibility. Because a drug helps to alleviate symptoms, it does not mean that it acts on the pathway that has generated those symptoms. This is completely obvious. The trite example is aspirin and headaches. Aspirin works to alleviate your headaches, but your headaches are not due to an absence of aspirin or a deficit of aspirin in your neural pathways. Now, some critics, notably Joanna Moncrief, in her book, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, have developed this into a general theory of the way in which some people find some drugs helpful. They're helpful not because they act on the pathways that have led to the distress in the first place, but because they act independently and indeed sometimes in a damaging way on other neural processes, thereby mitigating the symptoms and experiences, blunting emotions, muting perceptions. And actually, as it happens, this was the view of the people who first developed the early psychiatric drugs, chlorpromazine, the so-called neuroleptics. They cause some kind of brain damage, but the damage was the price worth paying for mitigating the symptoms. Now, there's another thing we can learn from the psychedelics, which actually is rather important, and it refers to what's called set and setting. Now, I know very well that the consequences of ingesting a quantum of alcohol are not inherent in the drug itself. And other people tell me that the same is true with cannabis and LSD. That is to say, the effects of the drug are shaped by expectations, the way in which the experience is encoded and given meaning, the social setting in which it's ingested, at a party, in an evening with a partner, or in the long, dark night of the soul after the end of a relationship. This opening of the doors of perception by set and setting is well known for those who use or research the psychoactive substances in rituals, for example, but it's yet to penetrate the thinking of most of those who work on legal drugs. Although for any sociology student in the 1960s and 1970s who's read Howard Becker's Becoming a Marijuana User, this is Sociology 101. Anyhow, in thinking about all this, I'm reminded of a saying that might have come from Michel Foucault. For 150 years, the search for the neural basis of mental distress has failed, and for 150 years, the response to that failure has been to search for the neural basis of mental distress. Well, it's about as true of the brain as it was of the prison, but it still tells some of the story. My fourth node is biomarkers. The search for brain-based indicators of mental disorder. About 15 years ago, a process for the radical revision of the diagnostic and statistical manuals was begun. And that was the process that actually had been initiated with the publication of the third edition of DSM in 1980. Now, those of you who know about the diagnostic and statistical manuals will know that this is a kind of checklist of observable symptoms, but it was always based on the belief that ultimately researchers would be able to identify a common biological basis for each category, which would be evident in the path lab, in genetic tests, in physiological indicators, and it would lead to an ability both to diagnose and on the basis of this psychopathophysiology and to treat effectively on the basis of known underlying biological pathways. And for the next 30 years after DSM-3 was published, there was an intensive search for these biomarkers that could give the DSM categories a biological objective underpinning rather than relying on case histories, on patient interviews, and other observable evidence. Millions and millions of dollars was spent by the NIMH and other organizations, and a lot of this research was also undertaken by commercial companies who hoped to co-market the test for the biomarker and the drug that would treat the disorder. As neurobiology progressed, technologies such as brain imaging, genetic sequencing, genome-wide association studies became more sophisticated, larger in scale. Many were confident that this would lead to a major leap forward in this new revision that was going ultimately to lead to the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. You'd have more accurate diagnosis, you'd have more accurate choice of treatment, and of course there was the law of early intervention. You could diagnose on the basis of these biomarkers before the emergence of frank disorder. You could intervene early and you could intervene preventively. Steve Hyman, the previous director of the National Institute of Mental Health and someone who I have a great deal of respect for, was one of the instigators of the revision of DSM, and in 2003 he outlined his hopes for biomarkers in Scientific American. And this is what he says, and I'll just read this one out. By combining neuroimaging with genetic studies, physicians may eventually be able to move psychiatric diagnoses out of the realm of symptoms checklists and into the domain of objective medical tests. Genetic testing of patients could reveal who's at high risk for developing a disorder, such as schizophrenia or depression. Doctors could use neuroimaging on the high-risk patients to determine whether the disorder has actually set in. I don't want to sound too optimistic. The task is daunting, but the current pace of technological development augurs well for progress. And I won't look at these slides because we haven't got time, but over the period when he was writing, we were beset with claims to have discovered the biomarkers for autism, the biomarkers for Asperger's, the biomarkers for depression, the biomarkers for dementia, and the biomarkers for much more. But none of these claims to have discovered biomarkers stood the test of replication or the rigors of clinical translation. And to his great credit, Steve Hyman was one of the first to recognize this and the implications. In 2008, just 5 years after that earlier article, writing in Nature Insight, he was forced to recognize the fundamental problem. He says there are no clear boundaries between ill and well. There are no simple genomic disorders in psychiatry. Common mental diseases are actually families of diseases that share major pathophysiological and symptomatic features but can differ in many ways. Similar symptoms can arise from different combinations of risk factors. The same genomic variant may be associated with multiple diagnoses. Identification of common risk-conferring variants has proved extremely challenging because the relatively small contribution to the disease phenotype and the diverse genetic environmental factors that lead to these common diseases. Now, in the months prior to the publication of DSM-5, when it became clear that there would not be a single clinically validated biomarker for any psychiatric disorder, policymakers in psychiatry were faced with a dilemma. Were they to conclude that the search for the underlying brain signs of disorder had failed, that there were no signs to be identified in a way that was clinically useful in the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders? It seemed that that was unthinkable. But the response was equally unthinkable, but yet it was thought. Thomas Insel, director of the NIMH, and Stephen Hyman, his predecessor, now director of the Broad Institute, both thought the unthinkable. Give up DSM. DSM, which for 3 decades had been the fundamental organizing principle of psychiatric research, of publishing of scientific articles in psychiatry, of drug development, of hospital records, and at least in the US, of much, much more. Whereas once it had been on the basis of DSM categorization that subjects were recruited into trials, and DSM categories underpinned the whole setup of NIMH-funded research, you couldn't abandon the brain, so you had to abandon DSM. You'd no longer categorize on the basis of the manual. Instead, you'd mine the data itself, genetic, neurobiological, brain imaging, whatever, in the search for clusters. This is the method of the research domain criteria, now advocated by NIMH, and it's also, as it happens, the approach which is being undertaken in the medical informatics platform of the Human Brain Project. Let the data mining do the work. In the age of big data, aggregate and mine, and let the algorithms take the strain. So what are we to make for this approach? Indeed, one may find variations, probably rather small ones, in some of the basic neurobiology of people diagnosed with mental disorders, related to cell membranes, ion channels, and so forth, probabilistically related to some aspect of the disorder. And you might aggregate many, perhaps hundreds of these, to find an algorithm that can cluster the data in a way that maps onto clinically recognizable disorders. But do statistically generated algorithms identify causal biological pathways? We don't know. Can you move from probabilities to individual cases? With great difficulty. With brain signatures, will brain signatures usher in a new world of personalized medicine, early diagnosis, preventive intervention? That is doubtful. With clinicians, will clinicians and patients find them plausible? I think that's extremely unlikely. So we're faced with this paradox that the whole direction of contemporary neuropsychiatric research is based on the belief that there is an underlying brain disorder of all mental distress. And we're now based with a very powerful and very well-funded research program to try and bring that into existence. Will it succeed? Well, as one says, more research is needed. In any event, I'm deeply skeptical of the aspect of personalization that I've called screen and intervene. Why wait until a child shows antisocial behavior or depression? Let's try to pick up the earliest signs. And since these are brain disorders, these early signs should be in the brain. Let's search for biomarkers in the brain. Let's do brain imaging, genetic markers that will enable us to predict in advance whether a child is going to develop the disorders, and then intervene beforehand to avert the horrible things happening. My dear colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry are researching twins as young as 8 who show signs of conduct disorder in schools. They use brain scanners, and they've identified patterns of brain activity in some of those 8-year-old twins that they consider to be similar to patterns of adult psychopaths. For these researchers, it's a good thing that you can predict that a particular child is likely to develop severe antisocial behavior, because the life of that child will be a miserable one. They'll get into trouble with the law, they'll go to reform school, they'll trouble their families, etc., etc. Surely it's a good thing to intervene to prevent individual and social misery. This isn't fatalism, the brain is malleable, and the whole purpose is treatment and prevention. But what are the consequences of identifying a child as a potential psychopath at the age of 8? Of telling the parents, of telling the school, telling the doctors, telling the social workers, and indeed telling the child that the child has a high risk of developing severe antisocial personality disorder. Well, every odd problematic behavior will be scrutinized as a potential sign of the emerging disorder, not least by the child, him or herself. And what about the problems that surround screening? The large numbers of false positives, the large numbers of occasions where children will be wrongly identified at high risk, with all the consequences of the interventions that follow. Recall PSA screening for prostate cancer, recently described by the inventor of the PSA test as America's greatest public health disaster. Or recall screening of asymptomatic women over 40 for the signs of breast cancer. Again, if you look at the meta-analyses, if you want to know the number necessary to screen to avoid one death, the number of false positives, the number of false negatives, the number of false intrusive interventions. These problems are great even where the markers of future disorder are well specified, which is certainly not the case in any psychiatric condition. And of course, we've got no proven interventions that are going to make any difference whatsoever. So you can imagine the consequences if such screening programs were to become widespread. So this is just one dimension of my fifth node, from the lab to the world. During the 50 years between Schmidt and Mountcastle, with the exception of the psychiatric drugs, neuroscience was largely a matter of the laboratory. It was a matter of experiments, proof of principle, understanding things at a cellular and molecular level. But it's not a matter of the laboratory anymore. I could talk a lot about one dimension of this escape, the problems of translation from findings in the lab to the wild world where they have to have their point of application. This translational imperative, as I call it, is now so ingrained into the funding system for scientific research, so obliged are scientific researchers to constantly claim that their work is soon going to be in the clinic helping patients, etc., 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 that it's constantly necessary to point to the multiple fallacies on which it's based. Evidence suggests that the timescale of translation from research findings into clinical applications for those few pieces of research that translate at all is around 15 years. The research that translates best and fastest is not this basic biomedical research, bench to bedside, but it's applied clinical research. Most changes in the clinic arise not from one piece of research, but from many. The pathway is often from clinical findings back to the lab and not the other way around. Now, this isn't an argument against basic research in neuroscience. It's quite the reverse. We should do all that we can to loosen the grip of this translational imperative on the regimes which we have to use to justify our research and on the imagination of our research funders. But here I want to just focus for a few moments on a slightly different issue of translation moving from place to place, what one might term neuropolitics or governing through the brain. I was going to have to use that term at some point, I know. Of course, the drugs are one way of governing through the brain, as indeed were biomarkers and their logic of screen and intervene. There's been lots of excitement about our criminal justice system and the transformations that might be generated by neurobiology. An end of free will, my brain made me do it, and so on and so forth. Actually, I think the evidence is very strong that this is not what should concern us. The courts, even here in the United States, have proved very good at defending themselves against the incursion of speculative claims from positive sciences about the cause of clinical behavior. And I think the same is true if you look at the way in which neurobiological evidence is treated in the court. In fact, the place where neurobiological evidence in the criminal justice system is likely to have more purchase, excuse me, is not inside the courtroom, but it's outside the courtroom, where the constraints of trials, of judges, of a rigorous testing of the evidence are much less strong. In neural lie detection, which is ineligible in most jurisdictions, but is still used in many investigations, not just here in the United States, but in other jurisdictions like in India, and in many other neurotechnologies that appear to have the capacity to identify and calculate an individual's risk. So it's not in the courtroom in the determination of guilt or innocence. It's outside the courtroom in all those practices of risk management and risk control that one is beginning to see the incursion of neurobiological technologies, and they're already making some headway, certainly in the UK, in relation to sexual offences and paedophilia. Now, there's much excitement about neuroeducation, although here I am a little bit cynical. Because I think it hardly makes much difference to believe that it's the brain that's transformed by educational interventions rather than the child's psychological capacities. And of course there's neuroeconomics, not that anyone ever really believed that humans were rational actors. And one has to point out that the so-called nudge technologies that claim to be based on neuroscience are in fact not based at all on contemporary neuroscience. Excuse me. It's the attempt to project my voice, so if it really starts going, please wave at the back and I don't know, I'll walk around or something like that. Excuse me. Nonetheless, all these claims, like neuromarketing, social neuroscience, and so forth, demonstrate that a whole array of matters that used to be problematized in psychological terms are now beginning to be framed in terms of the brain and neuroscience. At the most general level, the idea has taken hold that our idea of neuroscience will enable us to predict, our understanding of neuroscience will enable us to predict or prevent all kinds of social and personal problems, to organize our social and political life better. So neuroscience has ceased to be a matter of the lab and become a matter of everyday life. Now, when critics focus on this, they tend to point to the negative and reductive consequences of neuroscience. But one of the characteristics of contemporary life sciences is their hopeful nature. Hope not as blind faith or banal optimism, but hope linked to the possibilities that knowledge will enable intervention that will make things better. And in fact, that's exactly what was happening with my dear colleagues who are working on brain biomarkers of psychopathy. That hopeful nature has extended to the brain. If the brain was the fixed determiner of our life, if your life was fixed by your brain and the characteristics of your brain were outside human control, where would be the space for hope? But over the last 30 years, the argument has taken shape that the brain is perhaps the most malleable organ of all. Of course, the brain is changed by experience. Learning demonstrates that, and this has long been understood in terms of synaptic plasticity. As Donald Hebb put it in 1949, what fires together, wires together. One of the things I can still remember, very few things I can still remember from my early training as a biologist. But from the 1970s onwards, a series of discoveries raised this argument about plasticity to another level. First, there was research that showed that after brain damage that appeared to paralyze a limb, the brain could, quote, rewire itself. If structured exercise was undertaken, the brain could rewire itself and gradually reacquire its capacity voluntarily to move the limb. Some of this research was done with animals and was exceptionally controversial because it involved the ablating of parts of the animal's brain and immobilization of the animals, and some of the most early and most significant animal cruelty cases were brought in relation to one of these sets of experiments with the so-called silver spring monkeys, which, if you can see it, there's a little picture of the silver spring monkeys in their cages up there. Nonetheless, the argument took shape that both in animals and indeed in humans, as in the work of Paul Bacchi-Rita on human rehabilitation after stroke, that if you stimulated people enough after brain damage, their brains could, quote, rewire themselves even in adults. In this sense, the brain was plastic. And in the 1990s, researchers, in particular a Canadian group led by Mike Meany, began to develop a different argument about plasticity. This was an argument about epigenetics, or at least that aspect of epigenetics that focused on the way in which environmental influences shape gene expression. In Meany's work with mice and guinea pigs, the earliest relation that a mother has to her pup can shape the expression of genes in the brain of the pup, therefore shape the way in which that pup's brain develops into adulthood. This shapes the way in which that pup treats its own pups, which in turn shapes the development of the next generation's pup's brain, and so on down all the generations. Genes, in the sense of the inherited sequence of DNA bases, are not determinant. The way in which they play out in the body and the brain is a matter of milieu. And the third major change arose from the work of Elizabeth Gould on the bottom of your screen here on so-called neurogenesis. The adult mammalian brain was capable of making new neurons as a response to experience. It was always thought that after the first years, mammals had a fixed complement of nerve cells, and it was pretty much downhill all the way from then on. There were some quite good arguments as to why you couldn't suddenly insert new neurons into the mammalian brain. And these arguments prevailed despite a series of experiments in the 1980s and 90s that appeared to prove them wrong. But in the end, Gould and her group made it indisputable that the adult human brain could create new neurons in response to stimulation. There's still dispute about the extent to which these new neurons are actually integrated functionally into neural circuits, but very rapidly all these researchers began to make arguments which extrapolated from their work to the work of the everyday world. If you could make new neurons, if you could rewire the brain in response to experience, then perhaps certain kinds of bad experience prevented you from making new neurons or forced you to wire your brain in one way, and the brain could be intervened in order to rewire itself in response to calculated modulation. So in this way of thinking, humans have open, dynamic, plastic brains in which, to use the phrase that's now becoming common, experience can get under the skin and shape the brain for good or ill. This is perhaps the most fundamental platform that's enabled neuroscience to claim a social relevance. And nowhere is this more central than in relation to the brain of the child, and in particular the child's brain as it's developing. Because the child's brain, especially in the first years of life, is developing incredibly fast, and it then undergoes another rather fundamental change at the time of puberty. Now, my colleague Jean-Pierre Changeau, who I work with on the Human Brain Project, is fond of saying that when human beings emerged in Africa, average life expectancy was 30. Homo sapiens reached puberty at the age of 13. That's to say, human beings were evolved to spend half their life building the brain that would take them through the second half of their life. So this argument that the brain is developing moment by moment, coupled with the idea that you must do everything within your power to combat the burden of brain disease, has led to a whole series of interventions to try and shape and determine the brain of the child. In the early 1970s, many working in social policy argued that there was, quote, a cycle of deprivation in which early experiences from bad parenting shaped the psyche of the child and made the child itself, in its turn, a bad parent, passing the problem down the generations. Today, these same arguments are mapped not onto the psyche, but on the brain, often using brain images of children from very deprived backgrounds to support the argument that resources are needed to help these families. And this is the paradox here, that pictures of the brain consequences of bad parenting are explicitly deployed by those who wish to aid and support and bring additional resources to those in the worst possible circumstances. A slightly paradoxical situation. Now, the other side of this rationale of screen and intervene is a whole emerging discourse on resilience. If one knows that some children are very vulnerable and their brains are damaged by their early experiences, perhaps one can identify what makes some other children cope so well with those experiences. What makes some children resilient? How can you promote resilience in children so that the child itself has the capacity to resist the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? Resilience is a rather under-investigated phenomenon compared to its opposite, vulnerability. And for those who take the position of critics, the contemporary emphasis on resilience is seen as the high point, the apotheosis of neoliberalism, because it stresses that it should be the child or the adult who has the capacity to deal with problems, to bounce back after adversity, to cope with challenging conditions, and that one can build these things into the brains and into the bodies of the children and the adults themselves. And those who argue that this is the apotheosis of neoliberalism argue that this is a justification for those who wish to withdraw state and social support from precisely those families. Don't ask for support from others, be resilient. I actually think that that is a very narrow way of interpreting some of these arguments about resilience. And we were just talking earlier today about some of the ways in which these arguments for resilience can be used in a tremendously empowering and supportive way for some families and some populations. Well, I've pretty much exceeded my time, so I guess I should move to some kind of conclusion. I can see Dominique there waving the red flag at me. I started by saying that this work was an exercise in historical ontology. Who do we think we are? What languages do we use to understand ourselves? How do we judge ourselves? How do we explain our failings? What kinds of creatures have we become? Some of those who work on the sociology of the neurosciences have been very critical of the rise of these neurosciences and argue that they have indeed produced a fundamental mutation in our understanding of the kinds of persons that we are. Alain Ehrenberg, writing in France, suggests that we become what he calls cerebral subjects. Fernando Vidal suggests that we've moved from a regime of personhood to brainhood, where the state of being a person and the state of having a brain are one and the same thing. And Emily Martin, whose work I admire greatly, has argued strongly against neuroreductionism, saying that this leads to a complete forgetting, a complete effacement of meaning, of culture, of language and signification. They like to remind us of a phrase from Clifford Geertz: human beings are creatures suspended in a web of significance that they themselves have spun. And for many from the human sciences, it's not biology or neurobiology, but meaning, but language, but culture that makes humans human. And we are moving away from those understandings of human to a kind of reductionist focus on the brain that elides or effaces all those things that we know about what makes humans humans. In that book, Neuro, I argue that this is a rather fundamental misunderstanding of the transformation that is occurring. And that transformation that's occurring looks rather like this. Not that humans are brains, but that humans have brains and that humans should take responsibility for the management of their own brain. Become a manager of your own neural state. If your brain is flexible, if your brain is malleable, you can't leave it to others to make sure that it's shaped in the right way. You have to take that into your own hand. You have to learn techniques and technologies of your own neurobiological self. and you don't have to spend very long on the internet to discover that many people are happy to sell you a whole range of little technologies that you can use to transform, to rewire, to maximize, to enhance your own brain. Become a person who is responsible for your brain. Govern yourself through your brain. Okay, it's not clear, really, if neuroscience will gain the hold on our existence that psychology did in the 20th century. But at least we can begin to identify some of the things that are emerging, and in trying to understand them, perhaps we can play some part in shaping that future. And let me just make 3 very quick points in conclusion. First, as I've already indicated, the best way to support neuroscience is to urge humility upon it, to warn of the dangers of brain overclaim syndrome. The human brain won't be simulated anytime soon, nor will we understand the neural pathways that underpin consciousness. In the same way as the Human Genome Project taught us that almost everything we thought about the human gene was wrong, so I suspect will the Human Brain Projects. They illustrate well that old cliche, the more we know we don't know. Second, as I've suggested, we should try and mitigate this translational imperative. For if we want to maintain trust in science, develop scientific literacy, as I do, we need to break free from all these stories of miracle cures by individual scientific geniuses and recognize the hard, long, mundane slog that scientific research entails, the risks and uncertainties involved, the long and winding path between the laboratory and the clinic. And third, we need to remind neuroscientists of some basic facts without which their work will be scientifically problematic. As Claude Bernard argued in 1865, an organism is more than the sum of its parts. We really must learn, he said, that if we break up a living organism by isolating its different parts, it's only for ease in experimental analysis and not in order to conceive them separately. When we wish to ascribe to a physiological quality its value and true significance, we must always refer this to the whole and draw our final conclusion only in relation to its effect on the whole, close quotes. So when this comes to the brain, we've got to constantly recognize that the brain is in the body, intimately connected with all aspects of that body, dynamically developing in transaction with its environment. Any worthwhile conception of the living organism has to be able to withstand the test of vitalism, the test that vitalism constantly poses to us. If we can overcome mechanism, if we can replace the human organism in dynamic interaction with its milieu, if we can begin to breach the disciplinary walls between 2 sciences of the living, the neurosciences and the social sciences, then perhaps neuroscience can become a genuinely human science. Actually, I think that probably means human science that breaks with humanism, which these 2 little quotes on the board indicate. But that's another story. I've already gone on far too long, so thank you for your attention.
Thank you. That was more than stimulating. We now have 4 panels. Our reception will be held at Beckett Hall starting at 6 p.m. We didn't get our little printouts done in time because of the snow, but you're all warmly welcome to that. We're going to start in order with, so you can and then we'll have time to open up questions after asking Professor Roach to maybe reflect on the response. That's actually Professor Hecker's not working for projection.
Yeah,
We're just recording. So if you could put it on, let's see your.
Sure.
So I want to thank thank once again the four panelists and invite Dr. Heckers up.
Very good.
5-minute reflection. Up to the podium, is that all right?
Oh,
Just to
sure.
give a bit of
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and share with you some of my thoughts that I had reading the paper that Dr. Rose sent us earlier and also captures the talk that he gave today. I want to focus on three things. I want to focus on the never-ending task of enlightenment. I want to focus on what is order and what is not order. And I want to reflect on the power or the limits of reductionism. So I was quite pleased to see Dr. Rose start out with a quote of, by Michel Foucault on how to define enlightenment. That's really relevant for our enterprise because whether you are a physician, whether you are a neuroscientist, or whether you're a sociologist, we all stand on the shoulders of those people who in the second half of the 18th century claimed that we have to think for ourselves. That it's not the church and not the government that has to think for us, but we have to think for ourselves. That's the Kantian introduction to the whole idea of what enlightenment is. So there was great optimism that we can finally leave behind all of those shackles that held us back for literally thousands of years. But immediately when you start on the never-ending task of enlightenment, you have to ask yourself, who discovers the self? So that goes back to the question of how much are we agents of this enlightenment and how much are we objects forced by others to engage in what is normal, what is not normal, what is a healthy lifestyle and what is not a healthy lifestyle. Many attempts were made against the Enlightenment efforts. The Romantics started immediately after Kant kind of closed his books and said he had discovered the basic principles of how Enlightenment has to function. The Romantics refuted that at the most basic level and said that reason will never capture the human condition. Freud, of course, is very well known to, on the one hand, be in the tradition of enlightenment, but at the other hand, also make clear to us that we, as conscious beings, might not be fully in control of all of the thoughts that we have. And finally, people like Adorno or Michel Foucault have seriously challenged the entire project of enlightenment as it is controlled by either societal forces or our own forces. Whether we believe in enlightenment as a project that we have to engage in as scientists or as citizens of a society, ultimately we have to answer the question, can we define order? And this was very relevant for several of the points that were made in this talk, that if we cannot define order, we cannot define psychiatry, we cannot define the need for treatment, we cannot justify many of the interventions that we currently take for granted. So how do we define order? Now Kant, interestingly, really one of the most fundamental philosophers on the project of enlightenment, felt that there were unresolvable first principles that we can never understand at the level of the brain. Captured in this very nice sentence, the I think has to accommodate all of my representations. And this I think cannot be resolved any further by either philosophy or by neuroscience. So over the last 50 years, there is a significant revolution that has happened in psychology that's often referred to as cognitive neuroscience revolution. And the hope was really, after we have tried, since Kant's Enlightenment charge, to discover the order in the mind, and that has not been successful, that we might have to discover the order in the brain. And maybe secondarily, we can then discover what really drives the mind. This has led to very basic principles such as the modular approaches and the architecture of the mind, cognition, vision, memory, and so on, and dividing them into smaller and smaller pieces, all the way to, let's say, the memory system in aplesia. That, however, does not address the more challenging notion of how we define order as a societal mandate for intervention. And we heard several significant criticisms of psychiatrists' claim that we can, number one, define disorders in the first place, since there is really no clear border between well and ill. And even if we could, whether we actually have the ethical mandate to intervene, and often captured today in the movement called neurodiversity, putting out the hypothesis that even if we can find clear changes in brain structure and function that will define not normal brains, we cannot from that infer that we, in the majority position having normal brains, can then force the minority into the fold. Last but not least, a scientist has to reflect on the power or the limits of reductionism and how well or how little it actually has achieved so far. Now, a lot of the medical students that I teach across the campus, when I asked them in my first lecture on psychiatry and whether they believe that neuroscience will ultimately discover the structure and the principles of the human mind, the majority of medical students would say, no, neuroscience will not. And they believe, I would say, in the pop psychology that was very nicely captured more than 150 years ago by Lewis Carroll, asking, what is mind? Never matter. What is matter? Doesn't mind. So there is this nihilistic attitude that we will never be able to get brain and mind together, that there are gulfs between our understanding of personhood, of mental states, and the understanding of the brain. And I think this lecture gave us very nice illustrations of the weakness of our inferences and the unbridled, if not irrational, exuberance that neuroscience will actually close all of those gaps and that we will be able to find all of those answers. So in the interest of the discussion, I would propose to you that the only reason that we still hold on to these very irrational expectations that neuroscience will discover all of those answers to the many questions is that we fundamentally are interested in what's happening to us as people, as persons in the future. And the prediction of the future, of what will happen to me as a person, ultimately drives the neuroscience and psychological enterprises. And if we didn't have that fundamental urge to understand what's happening to us in the future, we would not subscribe to these very exaggerated claims. So last but not least, in the project that's never ending, called enlightenment, it's difficult to balance the pride, setting us free from all authorities, to think on our own for ourselves, and at the same time also be humble. Because to be humble really means that we actually have limits of what we can and cannot achieve in this enlightenment project. And whoever can solve that balance of humility on the one hand and being proud of our scientific accomplishments, I think will carry the day.
So next we have Dr. Nacol from Science, and just make sure you put the clip on yourself.
Okay. Are you able to hear me up there? Okay, great. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Rose for coming, even under duress, our current conditions, and for the talk and the accompanying paper, and also Dominique Behague for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'd like to just make a brief mention before I get started of the disciplinary lens that I bring to this work. I'm an early modernist, and I'm interested in humanistic approaches to risk and politics in the 17th and 18th century discourses on governing subjects in the polity and in the economy. Particularly unruly subjects as of late. And so I share, I think, some of the questions that underpin this research, but I'm very happy to get a fresh perspective on them from a field outside my own. So today I'd like to think about two aspects of the work that was presented here today that are particularly resonant for me. So I'll confine myself to some short and I hope sympathetic remarks and questions in two areas. One on the problem of personhood, so node 6. And then also the question of interpretive authority and the problem of risk assessment and management. So first, personhood. One of the problems that Professor Rose's discussion of governing through the brain highlights very helpfully is, of course, the problem of personhood. So how do these new cerebral knowledges give us additional traction in our persistent investigations of what it means to be human or to bear personhood? Does attention to the workings of the brain get us farther along in our quest to articulate what it means to be a person? This is certainly a high-stakes political question. For many, if not most, political theorists of all different stripes, from the liberal to the neoliberal to the critical political theorist, attach great normative value to personhood and make it foundational to our understandings of what it means to be a political subject or a political agent, as well as what it means to be an object of coercion, discipline, and governance. In political theory, we have successfully, I think, unmoored our accounts of political agency and subjecthood from citizenship as a foundation. But many in my field cannot quite let go of the basic notion that both our normative and critical approaches to theorizing politics rest on personhood as a category immune to challenge. And as such, personhood is something that we have long sought to understand and account for, but it's not necessarily a foundation that we problematize as thoroughly as we might. From perhaps an even more vexing angle, I think our evolving understandings of personhood, when coupled with our normative attachment to it as foundational, have informed our efforts to regulate conduct and to make unruly subjects more manageable and to exclude some altogether from common life. Now, the old Enlightenment discourse attached to personhood is, of course, not contingent on the brain, but rather on reason. To be a person is to be of sound reason. So for me, the work presented and discussed today raises a number of provocative questions. Is this turn to neuroscience and the mutability of the brain continuous with these older discourses of reason and personhood? Or does it break with these older discourses in interesting ways? What is the political significance of the continuity or innovation that we see? More particularly, does the turn to the brain rather than to reason as a potential core of personhood and a target and object for governance broaden or narrow the category of person? And what are the consequences of this? How might this turn reconfigure our notions of selfhood and responsibility, as well as care and responsibility for others? So the paper we were given to accompany the talk very helpfully notes that the turn to the brain does not constitute a revolution in understandings of what it means to be a person, but might it have other more subtle or nuanced effects on conventional accounts of personhood? And I think the work that we witnessed today and read makes a very provocative gesture that neuroscience has helped us disturb the fiction of the autonomous, unfettered individual, what I would call the liberal political subject. But can it also complicate in helpful ways our understanding of the person, an even more foundational category, and make us look for other foundations? I'm not sure, but that was something that was provoked for me by the talk. Second of all, I was really captivated by the investigation of the brain figured as a biopolitical resource, a new object of governance, and a new facet of the project of governing conduct in different fora of human experience. And this gets me to the problem of risk, its assessment, and how it's managed. To wit, what does it mean to figure the individual as risky or at risk against the backdrop of neuroscience? And who determines this? This is, of course, a question about expertise, authority, and power, raised so beautifully, I think, by the talk today. So as we know, risk is first and foremost a category of knowledge attached to questions of probability of threat and harm, or more positively, profit and gain. The essay for today and the talk, I think, drew into question whether new technologies, brain scans in particular, produce more than new knowledge of the brain, but also new forms of interpretation, speculation, and probabilistic predictions of future outcomes, both good and bad. So the neurobiological complex on this read is a new site of power and authority in a risk society, one that might have an increasing monopoly on speculation and interpretation when it comes to mapping the brain and using that map to figure desirable and undesirable futures and assigning responsibility for shaping them. So my question is, which I think is partly answered already by the talk, what response ought we to make to this possible development? What are the implications of this emergent complex of knowledge production for profit and benefit, and who profits and who benefits? And likewise, who is secured and against what? So these 2 points come together, I think, when we confront the anxieties of the 21st century and sociability in our day and age. Anxieties that I actually think extend fairly far back into the early modern period as well, with its complex and shifting discourses about reason, personhood, and a safe and desirable society. So for me, engaging your work made me think about where we are with respect to these persistent questions. How do we understand personhood today? Does the turn to the brain help us discard earlier notions of personhood, or does it reinforce these older forms of knowledge with new techniques of knowledge production? What does it mean to take responsibility for the risky dimensions of personhood in light of this new and particular knowledge of the brain? And I think you've already answered this question, but my final question is, do we wish to democratize this process or to leave it in the hands of new authorities?
Well, great. Thank you so much for a wonderful paper and lecture, and just thank you everyone for, for this community. It's great. This is exactly what I think we want MHS to be doing, which is to be fostering kind of critical conversations across the disciplines, across the university, about issues that relate to the kind of critical engagement with, as Stephan just so nicely said, matters that everyone cares about health and well-being and science. I'd also say very quickly that just a quick shout out to the neuroscience graduate students who are here. I know that maybe some of the seeming attacks on science have maybe been a little unsettling for you, and so you're about 20 minutes away from boozing it up with us at the atrium of Buttrick. So we're heading there. Let me also say that I'm someone who is a psychiatrist and also a historian. So I trained in both disciplines before coming here, and the first big project that I did was a history of really the transition that we just heard about, a transition from psychoanalytic to biological models of the mind and of practices in psychiatry. And it's interesting for me that this transition that frames the paper and that frames the talk, the so-called transition from the psi to the neuro or to the bio, is interestingly, I think, something that's been going on for 50 years or more, maybe 80 years or something like that. And part of that is a question of personhood, but part of it is also a question of just the institutions that define and treat mental illness. And it was interesting for me in the research for the book Prozac on the Couch, that what I saw basically was that up through the 1950s, every department, pretty much every psychiatric department in the United States was run through a psychoanalytic paradigm. Psychoanalysts were the chairs of the departments. Psychoanalysts chaired the big, American Journal of Psychiatry, things like that. It really was the power structure, and so the psi model was very deeply embedded in the knowledge production of psychiatry. And if you jump forward just 25 years later or something like that, to use the metaphor of the talk, it was almost the night of the long swords, that all of a sudden every psychoanalyst was gone from at least the chair of an academic department, and all of a sudden it was taken over by a kind of biological paradigm. And the question I asked in that research was, why was it that we shifted so radically in the institution of psychiatry, from a psi to a neuro, and part of it was a clinical answer, so which I think was at the heart of the critique we just heard, which was that psychoanalysis had a hard time answering questions of efficacy. In other words, it's laid out this entire foundation, and neuro came in, or bio came in, and it said, actually, your treatments aren't working the way that you claim them to be. And it's interesting to look at, for example, the early studies that were trying to kind of debunk psychoanalysis. And basically every one of the early theories. So there was a neuro study that showed the unconscious isn't real. You can see the unconscious on a brain scan. There were studies of slips of the tongue, of jokes, of all the core tenets of psychoanalysis. And neuro came in and said, not only do we not need that, but also you don't even need to lie on a couch and talk about your mother for 20 or 30 years. Here's some medication. And so it was the treatment itself that became denatured. So partially there was a clinical shift that was behind this shift from the psy to the neuro, but there was also a cultural shift, which is to say that at least toward the end of what Glenn Gabbard and other people call the heyday of psychoanalysis, there was this assumption that psychoanalysis had gone way beyond its clinical expertise, and it had started to diagnose social conditions. In other words, it was getting way too far out into the social realm, and it was, the psychoanalysis of movies, the psychoanalysis of political protests, the psychoanalysis of race. These were all things that greatly outstripped psychoanalytic expertise, and the neuro or the came in and said, we've gone way too broad in a way. Let's just stick with what we know, which is the thing we can see, the thing we can observe. Now, it's interesting to note that the question of how is it that we then got to this point where 50 or 70 years on, we see critiques coming from sociology and anthropology and within psychiatry that are very similar to the critiques that were being leveled against psychoanalysis, which were these critiques of going too broad, that in a way the Prozac promised too much in a particular way, that it promised everything and it turned out it couldn't deliver. And it seemed to me that there are two kind of mechanisms of why it was that neuro potentially fell into some of the same traps as psychoanalysis. And one, again, is related to clinical efficacy. So maybe the boundaries of the neuro were driven out too broad by business or by funding agencies or by just the pressure of needing to kind of be the establishment and answer all of these questions. And Prozac became the promise. But I remember even during my residency, I started wondering, wait, there are 400 neurotransmitters and we only know 2 of them, and so how can we answer this Prozac promise when there's so much that's left unknown? But there was pressure to have an answer in a particular way, and so there were all these reasons in which I think it became too broad. But the other issue for me that wasn't talked about that much in the talk, but I think was implied, was also that as the neuro became broader, it also started to diagnose the social realm. That in a way it wasn't just this promise of the patient before you, it was also we can use these brain mapping technologies or brain technologies to diagnose broadly social conditions. And I'll give you one example. When I did my residency at Michigan, there was a huge project on the neurobiology of poverty. We spent millions of dollars and endless hours and things like that talking about what can we use brain scans to diagnose what's going on with poor people living in poverty. And it turned out after 5 years and a lot of money, and some people here may have worked on that project, we found out that actually growing up in poverty is incredibly crappy for your brain, that it inhibits all these things, and that actually there's a brain problem with living in poverty. And the reason that was a problem wasn't because the science wasn't good, it was because all of a sudden the neuro was confronting a social problem that it had no mechanism for whatsoever, because again it had thrown out social context. And so that's just one example of the ways in which I think moving forward, if we really want promise for some of the science that the neuro promises, that the answer is in part about humility, and I totally agree with that, but it's also actually moving back toward a science of the social context. In other words, in the work I'm doing now, I argue that that in a way, as we develop these neuro models for things like poverty or discrimination or racism or other factors like that, the humility isn't just that we don't know because the science doesn't tell us so much. It's also that it forces us to engage. Take poverty as an example. You need to know about food distribution networks. You need to know about oppression. You need to know about how people get around, transportation systems, that in a way you're coming up against inherently social issues. And so the humility for me is ironically the thing that psychoanalysis got debunked for, which is engaging with the social realms in order to fulfill that promise. Thanks.
And Sarah Igo, thank you from history. We're going to take questions after Sarah finishes and then listen. Okay, and I need to attach this. Let's see. Okay. Oh, that's got it. Okay.
Can you handle one more? I'm not going to waste my time on thanks, but I do thank you all for the invitation to be here and for the talk. So it hasn't been mentioned, and it might just be worth mentioning, that Vanderbilt is a player in this neurocomplex that may be emerging with a strategic plan oriented around grand challenges. Our very own Brain Institute, which was founded in 1999, and offshoots in areas ranging from law and neuroscience to music and the mind, in which Ben Folds took part. So he's also part of the neurocomplex, apparently. I am quite interested in the complexity of the complex and what this sketching out that Nick Rose has done so beautifully helps us understand about our emerging present. This talk, I think, presented something of a regime change, a transition, as Jonathan just clarified. But I actually think your work in some ways speaks to something else, a grafting on of newer ways of thinking about the self to older ways, and especially the psi ways of thinking about the self. It seems to me that what is coming is always layered on to something old, a latching onto something already there, and in our case here, I think to many psychologized sites, places that have already been the subject of knowledges, of course, about the self. So to me, this is a case perhaps of sedimentation rather than supersession, something like that. So when thinking about this question of who do we think we are, for me the question is really how thoroughgoing, in fact, are these new idioms being used to describe and regulate ourselves? How thin or thick is neuro-talk, as well as the question of how thin or thick is the neurocomplex itself? I want to ask how much tolerance there is. It seems to me quite a bit for multiple languages of the self to coexist. And I want to ask what we make of the fact that there appears to be profound conceptual overlap with prior ways of imagining and describing this entity, the self. Given that, I want to ask what the consequences are of the particular language we employ to describe the self and the justifications for describing it that way. That is a neurobiological self any better or worse than the other kinds of frameworks we've used to describe selfhood? Inevitably, for me, it raises questions, too, about what is beyond the neurocomplex, if anything is beyond the neurocomplex. What does its seemingly smooth and persuasive arrival say about our political, economic, and cultural moment? What has paved the way for it that is not simply the science? And I think you mentioned just briefly neoliberalism here, but there has been, of course, a kind of conversation about the similar languages of flows and exchanges and so forth in the economic sphere and in the scientific sphere. So I would like to hear more about that. But what I mostly wanted to suggest is that there is much old here, and I don't mean that in a cranky historian's sort of way, to say that that doesn't mean it's important, but I do want to emphasize what's old here in the hopes of figuring out what's new. The old is, of course, in the most general sense, the pairing of scientific discovery with human technologies of intervention, as well as the dream of correcting or perfecting, enhancing the human. But I think there are more specific ways, and what we're seeing now is old, even if it looks new. That is a political preference and a funding preference for more obviously scientific and objective kinds of approaches to deep human questions. A project over the course of the 20th century of sidelining the social and interpretive sciences for the harder ones. I think, too, the quest for economic calculability, the cash value of science, is old, as is the quest for scientific certainty, those sharp, colorful brain images that distort and yet seem so clear. Third, the problem, of course, of overclaim, as a number of people have mentioned, brain overclaim or psychiatric overclaim, or any other sort of overclaim. Behavioral science had its own version of that. As well as the moralism that persistently attaches to new knowledge about humans. Expert knowledge incites responsibility with implications for what people should do with themselves and for themselves. But most interesting to me is the oldness, the familiarity of the fact that the social implications of what looks radically new ways of imagining and talking, are often less transformative than we might expect. So to me, it's striking how traditional the uses of seemingly radical new knowledge are. That is, it all leads to better parenting, or something like that. Neurobiological reformulations of the human, if that's what is at stake here, have not really budged much at all the assumed social problems to be solved or the presumed social goods at stake in applying that knowledge to the world. So, is there any way in which this new vision, this neurochemical vision of the self, challenges our social priorities or goods? Or do the constants, the first movers in all of this, social order, regulation, always precede the self that is being imagined? In other words, why is the radical always so radically contained, in a sense? This may, I think, be related to how entrenched older concepts of selfhood are in our institutions, say the legal system, but it may go deeper. I wonder if the pressing companionate research agenda here is investigating the stubborn persistence of ideas about individual autonomy, morality, and agency, even amidst all the hype and dollars being directed at the neuro and embrained existence. The liberal subject and autonomous selfhood are very hard to shake, especially if you look backwards and you start ticking off the many modern developments that were supposed to reveal their essentially fictional quality. From landlessness and the transition to wage labor, to the interdependence of corporate capitalism in which risk itself, this abstract system, was supposed to be enclosed into the individual, to Freudian visions of an ego never in command of itself. I think all of those issues make me pause in thinking about how new the neuro vision is. Now I'm willing, in 30 seconds, to see some new things at work here. The possible challenge to some old dualisms between mind and brain, for example. The notion that biology may not simply inhibit, but allow, may expand possibilities. The funding picture, the translational imperative, may be truly new, the rapidity with which findings are meant to work in the world. But most of all, I'm very intrigued by the suggestion that the neuroturn may create the possibility of rapprochement between the life sciences and the human sciences. This is what I want to hear more about, the critical piece of the critical friendship, what in a long history of dispute and othering between the life and human sciences may turn into something new here. I am skeptical on the one hand, but hopeful on the other that this may be a period of critical friendship and that we might together clarify the preconditions for as well as the politics of our neurobiological age. Thank you.
Thank you to all four of our respondents. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Apologies for that, but we'll take a few questions for those of you who might. Yes, please. Could you just let us know where you're from, or just your name?
From the Department of English.
Yes.
I was very pleased that the last speaker mentioned the importance of your discussion to the strategic plan of our university, which is apparently going to be built on 3 pillars: the human condition, and the humanities. And I was wondering, given the uncertain and floating definitions of, let's say, subjecthood that I've heard this afternoon, like self, person, and human, whether some kind of reasonably settled definition can be offered of the human in the context of the discussion we just had.
All right. First of all, I have to apologize, A, for going on for too long, and B, because my colleagues here read a different paper, and I rewrote the paper on the... It makes the same points, but I rewrote it on the plane, so you suffered that. The paper that my colleagues read is actually published for bizarre reasons in the Cambridge Journal of Anthropology, so you can read that. I didn't want to do the same thing. Yeah, what is the human? That is precisely what is at stake here. And I think, I mean, I would just say just a couple of things. It is, what the human is precisely at stake and constantly changing, but constantly in dispute. I don't think we are seeing the ushering in of a radically new idea of the human. I think, as was said, we're seeing the layering of one notion of the human onto the other notion of the human. We have some, as Charles Taylor says in his Sources of the Self, we have some deeply embedded notions of what human beings are, which are not easily transformed. But the other thing that I would say, and again this is just echoing some of the comments, is that it's characteristic, I think, of many societies, but certainly our own, that there's not a single way of conceiving of the self, the person, or the human. There are multiple different ways in what Max Weber called different departments of life, and how we conceive of ourselves in the bedroom is not always the same as how we conceive of ourselves in the workplace or how we conceive of ourselves in our places of religious prayer. So we need to avoid over-generalizing here. Something is happening, I believe, but not so much. And certainly it's not the effacing of these older notions of the human. So what's important, I think, if one's doing this in an empirical way, is to see what ideas of self, person, or human are being deployed in what practices, by whom, in what ways, and towards what ends. When I made my arguments about psychology, which is what I was working on for a very long period of time, I argued that psychology did have the capacity to colonize everything from the prison service to the education system and indeed to the bedroom, but it remains to be seen whether neuro has precisely that kind of versatility or whether it remains just a thin sort of a crust. So, and I think, again, as was said here, we're seeing in neuro things that we saw in Psy, in psychoanalysis and whatever, often a repetition of the stuff about parenting. Oh yes, I blame the parents. I used to work for the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. I saw many films of bad parents who did not look their children in the eye, but turned the children the other way and jiggled them up. And I see exactly the same films these days, only they're in colour, and they're about how the mother-child interaction shapes the development of the child's brain. The same lesson is taught in I Blame the Mother in many different ways. I could comment. Do you want me to comment on the comments, or is that unfair?
A few more questions, and then maybe comment on the comments. Yes, one here, and okay, we'll start up there.
I'm in the Oyster Online Learning Program, and I'm speaking to the best of my ability from the third amendment. Deborah Bloom has said the most intellectual environment in the world is the woman's womb. And adding to that, Sir Winston Churchill said, the further one can go back, the further we can see forward. So my question, my leading up to saying this, it is my opinion that a lot of American people today have OD on the MLK dream, and they're suffering from mental indigestion of the 60s. And I'm wondering if you might speak to that.
Great. Okay, we'll take three, I think, questions, and then there was a couple hands here. Yes, can you just tell us?
Okay. So I'm in PhD student sociology, and I'm one of those Americans who tries to stick physical models of mental health that we can. But I also dabble in sociology of science and knowledge. So my question is really about risk societies and sort of the work of all this back, and the idea of pre-treatment as a form of reconstructing knowledge of the body, and sort of a movement of risk from products and interventions that Beck talked about. So external influences, even pharmaceuticalization as risk, to a shift of the body as inherent risk. And I was wondering if you could speak to how the brain comes about in that, with the brain becoming an inherent risky object that requires pre-treatment before any other as an intervention.
Okay, I think we'll just take Juliet's comment and then ask Professor Rose. Sorry, overloading you a bit, and then we'll let you rest up.
Drink.
My question was, on a crude level, it seemed like there were two competing narratives of historical development. One, which was this point that Professor Metzl emphasized, it was about the sort of substitution or replacement of the psi model by the neuro model. But then at other points you talked about how the 150 years there's been a search for, a sort of somatic understanding. And I think certainly before Freud there was the Griesinger focus was brain, disease is brain disease. So in a sense, there are these, two, narratives somewhat in tension. And I'm just interested to hear you speak to that, and whether this is less a question of the new neuroscience as one of the anomaly actually being the psi that briefly intervened in a period, or sort of a longer trend of a more materialist approach to mental disease.
Wow, Ryan, now I've got like 7 things to respond to in -1 minute, which I'm not going to be able to do. Yes, we've been here before. Yes, it's certainly true that the high point of neurology was in Germany in the mid-19th century, cultivation of the cortex. There's some really good historians of that period. And yes, it's true that those people also argue there was great social significance in their understanding of cortex and brain structure. And yes, they searched in vain for the cortical bases of things that had social and political importance. And I think it's interesting to ask that question. Was psi just a rather surprising and in a sense, a sort of intervention that we would not have expected, intervening in a long history of seeking to understand the somatic bases of human character written in the skin, written in the body. We see that going back to 18th century racial science and so on and so forth. So I think that's a really interesting question, to which we could have a long discussion, which we're not going to have right now. And again, I think, but it does speak to the question about risk in the body, predispositions in the body, the constitution being inherently risky. If you're trying to understand the character of a person, you've got to look in their body, not in what they say. Again, that's an older historical question. So the question is whether we've moved now to truth at last, which is what a lot of the people who are working on the brain say. Yes, they will acknowledge Griesinger and Broca and all these people, but they'll say, now we have the technology. Some people will say, phrenology was not so bad, but the problem with phrenologists, the feeling of the they didn't have the technology. Now we have the technology. Now our vision can walk amongst the tissues and activities of the living brain, and that's the crucial thing. We can get inside the living brain rather than the dead brain. So I think there's a longer argument about that in neuro. I'm just going to, if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to take a couple of, just make a couple of really brief comments about the interesting points there. Just a very quick point to Jonathan about the explanation of the socio-political in terms of the psychoanalysis and in terms of neuroscience. Of course, for the neuroscientist, that is both its huge strength. It's how it's moved rapidly out of the laboratory because of all these claims. And actually, I think not because of the deterministic claims, but as I tried to indicate, because of the hopeful claims. It's not that the body determines, it's the more we know, the more biological something is, the more mutable it is. The less biological, the more social it is, the more impossible it is to change. And so that's the argument that's really going forward. Of course, those are exactly the weakest points. But they are also points of entry for this relationship between the social sciences and the neurosciences. As it happens, when I get back here, if I get back here to London on Monday and Tuesday, I'm in a 2-day workshop, 15 social scientists, urbanists, 15 neuroscientists working on the urban brain, looking at how different types of urban living gets under the skin. So I think there is something there. And I'm convinced myself that there is a challenge to the social scientists, which is to open themselves up to the recognition that their subjects are living organisms as well as a challenge to the life scientists to recognize that all living organisms are shaped across their lifetime and across evolution by their existence in a milieu. And that's, I go back to Georges Canguilhem, Kurt Goldstein, people like that to try and understand this. Are we creatures of reason anymore? I think that's a really interesting question to ask. Is normality, is the normal person the reasonable person? Michel Foucault talks about psychiatry as a monologue of reason about madness. Now, I don't actually think it is reason anymore that's at stake, although I wish I was able to, in 3 seconds, characterize what it was at stake, but I don't think it's entirely reason. And I just, go back to the question of reductionism. I think no one can doubt, and I was a biologist, and I'm sure many of you here are, no one can doubt the power of reductionism as an experimental strategy. The purification and reduction that happens in the laboratory is absolutely crucial to understanding certain mechanisms. But from Claude Bernard in the 19th century onwards, the recognition that reductionism is not enough. If you're trying to understand an organism, a vital creature, alive, whatever that might mean, actively striving, resisting death, or reorganizing its environment around it every second, every millisecond of its life, then reducing it to a set of cells, membrane structures, molecules, and trying to build that up, that is never going to work. And it hasn't worked in neuroscience. It has not worked in neuroscience. It's the belief of my colleagues in the Human Brain Project that you can make it work by simulating the human brain, neuron by neuron, in a supercomputer. A brain in the vat struggle, if ever there was one. My own sense is that unless you recognize that humans, and indeed other organisms, are constituted by their relationship with their milieu from the moment of conception onwards, from the womb onwards, or probably even before the womb, you really won't understand much about them. And I know there are just a few life scientists who think that way, and we can work with them. I'd like to thank my colleagues for their very wonderful comments, and hope I didn't completely discombobulate them by doing the paper in a backhanded way, but it did kind of try to go over the same topics. But then I sort of decided that on the aeroplane, which was probably not the wise thing to do.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.